Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. But in any case, a very warm welcome to our fourth nexxworks webinar series, this time about health and well-being at work. It is moderated by Christophe Jauquet, so I will tell you more a bit about him in a few minutes. But just to get to know each other, my name is France. Despite my name, I'm living in Belgium, close to the nexxworks office. And the upcoming 3 weeks, I will be your host just behind the screen. I will moderate all the questions and help Christophe and the speakers out. So before we start, I will quickly introduce nexxworks on who we are and what we do. For the ones who know nexxworks, just bear with me. It will only take 30 seconds and then off we go. So nexxworks is a company with a global mindset, and we are mainly doing two things. On the one side, are we inspiring companies and innovators all over the world. And a second thing that we are doing is connecting companies and startups and consultants and keynote speakers with each other. So in normal times, we are doing this by physically going to places where the innovation or the customer brings us. So we are going to Shenzhen, Amsterdam, or even San Francisco or Ghent, for example. It's depending on where the innovation brings us. But in these COVID times, of course, we are also very active in setting up digital programs. So there we help to connect and inspire companies on a digital level, just as we are doing right now. Enough about us, about this 1 hour webinar. It's a 1 hour session where you are all automatically muted and the camera is off, but don't hesitate to ask questions, so don't act muted. And for non-question related things like sharing articles or links that you think your peers should know, just use the chat button here below on your screen. Then we are, of course, using online tools like Zoom and the internet, which is very heavily used these days. So please bear with us when there are glitches or when there is something not working. I think some patience will be the solution when something is wrong. And good to know is that we will send a recording and some slides that could be interesting, some articles afterwards as well. If you didn't receive anything by Tuesday, just check your spam folder, but because it might be in there as well, of course. Enough about us. It's time to go to the first speaker and to introduce him. I can say hi, Bill, who's here as a first speaker. Normally, we should see him. Hi, Bill. How is the morning treating you today?
Let's see. The sun has yet to come up, but it is warm.
All right. Thanks for being with us today. Christophe Jauquet will be the moderator today, so I will say hi to him in a minute, and he will introduce Bill, of course. Christophe is the author of the book Healthusiasm, which is about how people are occupied by being healthy and how companies should act on that as well. And as a health marketing expert, he's also coaching startups and companies. So if you have any questions about this, I'm sure that he will be happy to help there as well. So Christophe and Bill, I will give the floor to you and enjoy your conversation. And for the people here, the participants, I would like to ask you a lot of questions, and then we will have a very interesting session, I think. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you, Frans, and welcome to everybody. Welcome, Bill. I just might start off by introducing Bill properly. And I first read into his resume, and I really wanted to, do it profoundly and look all the things that he achieved, all the projects that he worked on. But it's way too much, and it wouldn't do any justice. People we would lose at least 10 minutes. So I tried to summarize it into one sentence, and it won't do justice either, but I'm pretty sure that we can build from there on throughout the entire conversation that we will be having. And that one sentence would be, Bill is a self-taught engineer who has worked at Google since 2005. That's very brief, but why do I think it's really good? I mean, we had a very brief conversation amongst us before this, and And there were those two elements. There are two elements in that sentence that really describe him well, according to what I've seen and heard from him, is that it's the part self-thought, and the fact that he really does what he believes in and what he wants to do, and he makes that happen because he really goes for it really hard. And the second part that is really important, I guess, is that he has worked at Google since 2005. And why is that important? It's because back then, Google was about, I don't know, it's 5,000, 6,000 people. If you look at how Google has grown and has basically become one of the biggest well-known companies in the world, well, he went through a whole lot of pressure and change, which actually, as far as I understood, really made his career and made every other project that followed after that sense from the experience that he had over there. And I think we can build on that later. I don't know, Bill, if that kind of resumes well or that rings well with you. How did I do there? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's been an arc of, if the situation I'm in requires me learning about a new topic, even if it's one that's not traditionally connected, like engineering to well-being or Buddhism to artificial intelligence, I've always felt that spark about wanting to learn it. So that's interesting. You're the first person that's pulled that out. And then also, I think there's this idea of the marriage of, sort of hard science with human science, which is inherently less precise. And I think many times people will either exist in one world or the other. So I think, yeah, those two things are well spotted.
Oh, cool. And within all that thing, I mean, I think what we will be talking about today is, and I stole that from one of your keynotes I saw, is that the world is increasingly becoming chaotic, unpredictable, complex, and sometimes even full of bullshit, as you like to mention it. And of course, within the pandemic reality we're all living in right now, I mean, this has become even more important, and certainly for companies, because people need to be at the top of their game. And as nexxworks is kickstarting innovation, we really want people to be able to do that. And so I guess today what we will be talking about is how, as a company, you can make your people more performant. Because this is also what you've lived at Google, right? When you started there and you saw things grow, there was a lot of pressure going on, and it actually made you switch. I wouldn't say switch, but evolve from being a pure engineer into becoming a wellness expert, right?
Yeah, and I did so because I needed to, not because I wanted to. My conception of health and well-being was, meditation was for like those people who weren't me, those people who maybe weren't as ambitious or performant or whatever. But I had there's this great term I love called success crisis. I joined Google in 2005 as a person with a liberal arts degree and an engineering leadership position, which was somewhat unlikely and certainly against what the reputation was of Google. And then I arrived at the perfect time. Had I arrived a year before, I probably would not have been successful. But they were at the point where they actually needed management that had different sorts of expertise other than hard technical expertise. So I kept on getting promoted. And the methods that I was dealing with the taking on of additional responsibility of managing stress ended up making the stress worse. So this was the bourbon and cheeseburger method of stress reduction, which, to use the language of engineering, doesn't scale. And as I think I mentioned, like at the same time that I was having all of this additional responsibility and doing things like drinking a lot and eating a lot that actually made it worse in the long term, my father also became very ill and began a process of dying. And so I think, we would like to compartmentalize our lives where we have our professional persona and our personal persona, but of course we all inhabit the same gear, the same body, the same, we call this a processor. And what I was doing was pushing me into the direction of needing medical leave, for the stress. And here I am, it's a great place to work, and yet I'm miserable, frequently. And I'm meeting all of these demands and challenges, which are quite exciting, really from a place of fear and not wanting to fail, which is not an innovative mindset. So as you mentioned before, I'm a curious person, and I got like, okay, well, what is stress? What is happiness? What is performance? And how does all of this apply towards, I loved the work I was doing in engineering. How do I make this all apply? So that then made me realize that we are mechanisms optimized for survival, not hard work or stress. So I'll leave it there, but that was the way in which it was necessary. I was struggling enough where if I didn't do this, bad things would have happened. So it wasn't like this sitting on a mountaintop decided that I wanted to care about health and well-being.
I noticed that you said I kept on being promoted, which sounded like a punishment of some sort. And that
it's funny. Everybody's ambitious. Everybody, if you don't join an organization like Google, even back then, without some real sense of wanting to do ambitious things. And certainly my relationship towards leadership there was one of intense gratitude. I started off as a program manager and was asked by my team to become their manager. And so that happened a few times where a group of people said, will you be our manager? Google's culture at the time was probably unique in that if people didn't want to be managed by somebody, then that person wouldn't be their manager. And it doesn't always reflect poorly on the manager. Sometimes it's just a fit issue. So to have that experience of asked to step into these greater areas of responsibility amongst this community of people that are so committed and so bright was certainly a very humbling experience. And, really stretches one's boundaries cognitively. And to step in constantly into up-leveling that game in order to be of service and do interesting work. So if you know what it means to be promoted into an executive position, that it is a double-edged sword.
Yeah, true. And as you said, it's not because you get energy from it that there aren't parts that actually drain your energy, whether it is in your personal or in your professional life, of course.
Absolutely. I remember very distinctly when I was an individual contributor being like, man, I'd love to be an executive because all you just got to do is sit around and tell people what to do. The truth of it, it really took me a while to adjust to, right? Because of the issues that you're dealing with. If they were simple, uncomplicated issues, they would be dealt with at the lower level. Therefore, by definition, all the problems you're dealing with are ones for which there is no easy answer. And one of the things I really had to adjust to was what happens when you have like a week or 2 weeks where all the decisions you're making, where the criteria is which option is the least bad.
Yeah.
And, and there's that role of leadership of taking responsibility for a situation you probably didn't have anything to do. It might be competitive pressure, but in order emotionally, cognitively to do well in that situation, you need to have a skill set for dealing with that. So I found that aspect of leadership to be different. And I think everybody who's gone from running a small team to a large organization learns all the differences and tricks you need to learn.
Yeah, certainly. And definitely with the growth that Google was going through back then, of course. But
I remember going to the finance people and it's been like, hey, I need to buy $2 million worth of hard drives. How do I do that? And they're just like, can you put it on a credit card? I'm like, can you give me a credit card with a $2 million limit? You shouldn't, but if you can. So that was how purchase orders at Google were born. So yeah.
So in that period, you were going through a rough time as well. The stress at work, but then also your personal difficulties, the period that was a bit hard very hard probably with your father. So at what point did you brought it to your work back and said, look, this is my life. It is impacting me. I want to perform well, but I've been under stress and it's not perhaps the right situation for me. At what point and how exactly then did you, perhaps already as an executive or not, did you take some action and went to other people to see how you can actually tackle this constant pressure? Because I'm pretty sure that on on the call here on the Zoom webinar, there are quite some people that are going through stress, whether it is a growth stress or a decline stress or the pandemic stress, or any team has stress right now. And so if they are here, they're probably also to learn about what are the small steps that you've taken, and what was the process that you went through actually.
Yeah, for me, the big awakening moment was one of the great things about Google is they have these tech talks, many of which are online on YouTube. And we would just have interesting people from all over the world come and give talks. Jane Goodall, the Vatican actually has an astronomy priest, and we had him in his wonderful conversation. And I went to a lecture on the neuroscience of emotion. And up until that time, I think like a lot of engineers, maybe like a lot of men, I had viewed emotion as being something complicated and in the way. And in my 20s, I remember thinking the world would be better if we didn't have emotion. What I learned in this lecture was that thanks to evolutionary biology, that emotion serves a crucial point. And not only that, but it's a mechanism. And in particular, when we look at it through the window of stress, is the stress response is a very highly efficient, effective way of protecting physical survival in the moment.
True.
It's actually brilliantly suited to do that. And throughout our history, this has been the most important things in our lives. If we have the privilege to work in an office, if we have the privilege where daily survival is not your task, this skill set is a little ill-suited to it. So for me, the big revelation was that my internal experience was a mechanism. It was something that could be understood. It just wasn't random witchcraft. And two is that the sense of pressure and stress and failing that I was feeling was as impersonal as rain. It was just, as humans, we have a tool set that in this context makes us act this way. And this way, while being really good for physical survival, is really unoptimized for knowledge work in general and innovation work in particular. So having understood that, I realized, okay, all of this well-being, emotion stuff is actually really relevant to me and useful, and I can learn this. One key takeaway for everybody is that we all come into this realm of high performance, innovation, well-being. These are all different ways of looking at the same thing with a certain base level of base level of skills. However, all of this is learnable. You know, looking back after 15 years of being very diligent about this effort, you know, my sister is like, you're a very different person than you used to be, people I used to work with. So the idea that this is a mechanism and these are skills that can be learned were the two huge takeaways. And then, you know, with the prime pumped with those two parts, just give me a whole bunch of books, and I love science, and I'll figure out how is the mechanism, which for me was like exercise, nutrition, sleep, meditation. And then that really allowed me to manage the human stress response. A little bit of stress is really good for the kinds of situations we're talking about, but not too much, how to manage that. And then, of course, it became obvious that this isn't just an individual game. As Darwin noted, humans are unique and the apex predator on this planet because we work in groups and use technology. But for the group part, this means that organizations are uniquely well suited to play a role in this. And this is a huge drawback of most corporate well-being programs, is that they focused almost entirely at the individual level.
Yeah, true. And I think, I mean, next week we will be talking a lot about stress. So it's actually the theme of the discussion that we will have with Dr. Lavinia. Still, I mean, it's nice to know how your body reacts and what actually is good stress or bad stress, of course. Still, I mean, the company was growing, I guess, and changing at a speed that probably none of us actually have ever lived before, because, I mean, there's only one Google around. So I must have imagined that you kind of like wanted to change the environmental factors or the job factors around you, the way that the company was managed, perhaps, or the way that people were managed at their jobs. What did you learn? How did you go about this to really make sure that there's rather the good stress and that the long-term negative stress, the pressure perhaps, would be left out?
Yeah, because it's important. I mean, it's important to note that if you want to do difficult work, it's going to be stressful. You know, the more ambitious, and when I say ambitious, I don't mean materially, monetarily, but if you want to do difficult work, if you want something to exist that doesn't exist, or if you want to change something, the harder it is, the more stress it's going to produce. So therefore we have to say, how do we manage where we are? What's the appropriate amount of stress level? And when we unpack that question, it's also important to realize that everyone's capacities vary. You know, so for instance, when my dad was dying, my capacity was lowered. It just was. My team, and this is part of the reason why I'm still in touch with people who worked on my team, you know, this is now 10 plus years ago. They checked in with me every day. Some days I wanted to work to get my mind off being in the hospital all the time. Other days I just needed nothing, no additional stress in my life. And every day they checked in with me and they said, okay, here's boss stuff we could use. And they would give me enough work as I asked for, right? So that idea of individual capacities rising and waning, and then the fact that one of the great things about being part of a work group is that you can actually trade work around so that it's for the person who has the most capacity, combined with interest and all of those things. And of course, managing a group like this, even though it sounds very much like assigning tasks, you know, my heart of being cared for in that way by the people that worked for me, like I knew they had my back. And therefore, after my father had passed away, I felt this huge desire of like, man, these people just did. And I felt that way about Google. Google made a corporate apartment available to me in New York. I live in San Francisco, so I could be with my father as he was dying.
That's amazing.
My sense of loyalty and connection and psychological safety to talk about deeply painful things in front of other people and to let people know I need help, even as the leader, that then creates the causes and conditions within a work group that research shows are extremely, you know, Google's own internal research shows that psychological safety is the #1 differentiator between high performing teams. And this speaks a little bit to the current situation with COVID. Is many cases to build this deep loyalty and trust and vulnerability within a work group requires difficulty.
True. Yeah.
And so there's the real opportunity to shift the current difficulty into creating these boundaried connections. We're not friends, but these really intense work connections that lead to this innovation, high performance, all the things that we know psychological safety brings.
Yeah, and I think psychological safety, and you mentioned it earlier as well, the force of a team is super important. And certainly right now in the pandemic reality, I mean, according to me, it's probably one of the biggest needs that we have is this sense of togetherness. We're in this together and we need to fight this together. We need to survive this together. And it's the same within a company. I mean, a team should really have that sense of togetherness so that they can actually perform at their best. And even, as you say, have that psychological safety to be who they want to be, and perform, or have the freedom to perform the way they want to perform. I think that's very important. I think the psychological safety made me think about something else as well. It's like the allowance of the fact that you can fail at your work and that you can make a mistake and that you just need to do it. Was that the same thing? And was the psychological safety also the fact that you had the freedom and the responsibility to try out new stuff and perhaps even fail at it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we might want to define psychological safety because it's a fairly vague term, but psychological safety is defined for this research was feeling like that you can put new ideas into the group without being attacked.
Wonderful.
So you can see the way that psychological safety is important for innovation, diversity and inclusion, and all of those other issues. And I think it's also important to note that a lot of Google's big findings about how teams work were started from the place of being wrong. You know, the research on what makes effective teams, the hypothesis was that it was length of service, people who had been around a long time, senior people, superstars who had worked on superstar projects. Wrong, 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 wrong. What we found out instead was it was these other issues around, you know, innovation and trying and failing. You know, one of the things that's really important and one of the huge drivers of the importance of diversity and inclusion is the concept of cognitive abrasion, that you actually need people in a room disagreeing in a way that then has the ideas out. One of my favorite things about Google engineering, we had a program called the Failies, which were awards given for the best failures. And, you know, they had a substantial cash prize. And of course, the award ceremony was very funny. And it was interesting because it forces one to define what is a successful failure. And the ways that successful failure were defined within Google engineering were, one is it was a good risk to take. Maybe there was only a 20% chance of success, but maybe there was a 50x revenue increase. So therefore it makes sense. Even if it was a $2 million mistake, it actually made sense with a 20% chance of success to go after, you know, whatever, 50x or 100x growth. Two is that if it disproved an important assumption that we were making, right? So I just mentioned one a little while ago, that it was technical expertise that was the most important thing in team performance. We found out, no, it's the opposite thing. So even if it results in something being messed up, if we learned, oh, one of our core assumptions is not correct. One of the core assumptions Google had to learn was that a monoculture, specifically focused around white dudes, even though it moves really fast because it's groupthink and it's a monoculture, creates all this other damage. So that was another key assumption about the Google culture that really had to shift.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I talked with a couple, I work with a lot of startups actually, and one of the startups actually told me that they had these weekly meetings, which they call Fuck Up Fridays, where they everybody needs to present their biggest fuck up. And it's not really like everybody needs to present something each week, but you need to feel the freedom to actually try and test, to make an error even. And
well, absolutely. I was working with a very large Eastern European bank, and they really wanted to implement Agile. And anytime you want to implement an iterative innovation work style or work solution, that means failing. Like, why would you need to iterate if you get it right the first time, every time? And, you know, I get it. I mean, but the problem is that when you have a culture of fear, and I get it for this client in particular, like Stalin had been their key stakeholder for a period of their history. Like, I get it. But you literally cannot innovate without failing. And the part where this then bridges in the first part of our conversation is that failure makes us feel afraid and terrible. And that's another word for stress. Sure. And the parts of our brain that are triggered by stress are the opposite ones you need to innovate. So there's two ways, is that the environment is changing massively in complexity, and it was doing that before COVID, and that is only going to accelerate as a result of after COVID, right? So the ground we're all standing on is shifting rapidly. On top of that, the work we need to do shifts rapidly. And if our brains are in this fight or flight mode, we cannot engage the parts of our brain that we need to do this iterative, open-minded, what if, managing complexity.
Okay, so let's bring this back to corporate well-being at work, because I mean, the one and sole reason why it is there is not to have a bigger brand name and attract better employees. No, the thing is you really want to have your people that work in your company be at the top of their game. So what did you see change within your period at Google, for example, and where did they come from and where did they head to? And what did you learn in that period, actually, when it comes to corporate well-being and making people more performant? I mean, you talked a lot about company culture and the way that your team behaved. Was that specific to your team, or was it more related to the overall company culture? And what would you suggest to other companies that actually are looking to have that culture or have this corporate well-being integrated in their own culture?
Yeah. So culture is always a matter of bottom up and top down. The way that top down culture is created is what behavior is rewarded, right? If you promote talented assholes, you're going to have a culture of talented assholes, and they're going to hire talented assholes. And then all of a sudden you have insert name of companies that you know are exactly like this, very high performing and fairly and fairly miserable. You know, one of the arcs that Google also went through. So there's top down, and then there's bottom up. So for instance, one of the ways is a lot of the engineering managers and I got together and we said, you know what? The engineering ladder, the job description of managers is all technical. We all know that we need this interpersonal, inter-team stuff, but no one is actually incented. Like if you're good at it, you're good at it, but there's no line in your job description that says get a check mark for it. So we wanted to take this cultural value that we all had found and instantiate it in something that would go beyond our little cadre of people who cared about this. So we volunteered and we said, we're going to redo the engineering job ladder and we're going to add basically people skills, mentoring, all these other things. Google's internal questionnaires and research had shown that Googlers wanted a better manager experience. Up until that point, we had said the least managers, the better. Managers would have 120 reports in some cases. Yeah, so, and here, this is really important. The story that was told was Google is a very flat organization and that's a good thing. But there's a certain point in growth at which that becomes a bad thing and people actually needed managers. So we stepped into this and we created, part of it was an ethos that we talked about, but part of it was also, okay, let's change the engineering ladder so that people are incented in their career and that we also have articulated that this is part of this. So that's what was happening within engineering. At one point, I switched from engineering to HR and then began to discover sort of the inside out version of that. And it constantly needed to be adjusting, right? Because the scale of the company was changing, the challenges, the product set was all shifting. So this constantly needs to be updated and it needs to shift.
And it was brought back into HR. And so corporate well-being is part of HR then? Is that how you see things or?
No. As a matter of fact, a problem with the way that a lot of times well-being is looked at by corporates is that it is a function of HR and in particular of the benefits organization. So we can have a very medical view of well-being. And, you know, I think one is that by the time that it becomes a medical issue, I'll use my own life story as an example, you know, by the time that I was looking at needing medical leave,
it's too late.
It's too late. It's too late. And not only that, there's also like, well, what are the causes? I mean, any manager, any engineer is going to want to swim upstream and deal with it because we all know that the intervention at the beginning is much more pleasant and easy than an intervention at the end. And of course, for corporates, you know, as soon as you have somebody out on medical leave, the cost is outrageous. So, you know, now I retired from Google a few years ago and I do consulting. And, you know, when I talk about, you know, value and return on investment, I said, look, if we keep one person from tipping over into medical leave, you have just saved yourself $120,000.
True.
It's not, you know, the ROI is not hard to hit. So to return to your question, something I think about having been in both HR and the line of business is that HR really has this opportunity to create these foundations, but a tendency to look at it through the medical area. And this is why with regard to like medical apps, they tend to have very, very low engagement, you know, within corporations, because, you know, we've been trained to say, as you seek you see the medical system when something is wrong or broken. So one of the things I loved doing was creating a partnership between the HR people. So this was the medical benefits people. This was also the learning, right? So when Googlers come in, when all these bright, mostly young people come in, what if right in the beginning we tell them, here's the deal about stress that you're about to get on a roller coaster, and you're going to need specific skills. You're going to have imposter syndrome. You're going to be stressed out. You're not alone. It's important that you reach out early, because we want you to be on a roller coaster, but we also want you to be healthy and happy, and you have to actively manage that. So I think when you then look at holistic well-being, how your manager manages, what goals are set, how do we deal with stretch goals? The way I would put this on with my team, and this was a fairly common thing, was, okay, guys, lights and sirens time. Like, this is nights and weekends for a few weeks, but then there was also the idea of the lights and sirens can't be on all the time. So there's this real continuum of medical benefits and childcare and nutrition and exercise and sleep. And it's important to have this really, and how you manage and the expectations of how we deal with conflict. This is all part of the same thing. And it needs to be broad, because what works for each individual varies enormously.
True.
So you need to put a whole bunch of things out there at different points. It's great to have the safety net of the medical stuff, but that can't be the only lens that we look at these issues.
Yeah, true. And the way I looked at it is, I consulted with quite some companies as well on corporate well-being. And what I've mostly noticed, certainly in Europe, is that I kind of compare it to like corporate well-being is like the orphan within the company. It's like nobody really owns it. It just floats around between HR, the medical department, prevention, some managers. There's some one-off tactical activities. One organizes a yoga class, there's a fruit basket, whatever, which barely has anything to do with corporate well-being for a starter. But on the other hand, I mean, we really miss the strategic view, which is led by a couple of people within the organization, most likely, as you said, HR, who puts out the fundaments, right?
Right, but there's a huge opportunity here. So right now in my life, I mentioned I left Google a few years ago, and I do some corporate work. I'm trying to have most of my work be some sort of social impact right now, but in particular in the corporate work, and I say this having spent 5 years working in Google HR. HR generally desperately wants to be seen as strategic advisors rather than paperwork pushers, right? So there's this idea of always wanting to be business partners. So a lot of times when I'm working with corporates, I'm not articulating it as well-being or mindfulness or any of those other things. Because as soon as you do that, you put this in a very tiny box, right?
Yeah,
Instead,
it people away, basically. It
Sorry?
scares people away if you just put it in that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been in the sales process, and you can just see the nice to have shutter click on and the blinds come down when they realize, like, oh, this is a nice to have. Our revenue just dropped because of COVID. We can't be spending money on this frippery. However, when I take a step back and say, like, we are living in a historical moment right now. I live right near, 2 blocks away is Haight and Ashbury, which was the epicenter of in the U.S. of the 60s counterculture. What we're going through right now is going to make that look like a small affair. And what do we need in this moment? You mentioned before, Christophe, and I am bitter and sad and angry that the United States is not responding as well as Europe in terms of unity. Some of the polls that you're seeing in Europe show that the vast majority of the people feel like that everybody is together, and that there is a need and an opportunity to fix systems so they are much better. It is with great sincerity that I hope in a few months America will be able to rejoin that community of acting in that way. So there's a huge opportunity. When I sell this work, I've been selling it as managing complexity and innovation, because it's the same. The skill set of everything we've talked about is trainable. Like, you can get better at this. And that skill set is, at the individual level, self-awareness, self-regulation, and connection and understanding, all completely trainable skills. And those show up as innovation, those show up as managing complexity. You know, all of these skills require this at the individual level, this sense of calm spaciousness, of being able to invoke the parts of your nervous system that are best suited to dealing with this class of problems and not being on autopilot. And then on top of that, you need to have the organizational part.
Yeah, true. I love what you're saying there, and it's pretty straightforward. And there was a question from one of the attendees that wanted to know, what is your favorite story or company regarding well-being at work? And I want to pick into what you said earlier. Where did you see, what company perhaps did you see the elements that you just mentioned working really well?
Yeah. I really like IDEO. You know,
Sure.
disclaimer, I do some work with them. You know, those are people that clearly get it. Ben and Jerry's recently is a company, interestingly owned by Unilever, you know, massive multinational, that have really been able to keep a sense of mission and purpose and an extraordinarily strong voice. I mean, what's the relationship between racial justice and ice cream? Ben and Jerry's has a very clear idea about that relationship. That's innovation. That's leadership. I've been, yeah. And then let me think if there's any other companies that really come to mind. I mean, I think the criteria is not so much that a certain company has figured it out, but rather that they are deeply in process.
And living in it.
They're living it. They're figuring it out, because it's always a balancing act. You know, there's this idea of the relationship between stress and performance is curvilinear. You have to be constantly adjusting it as an individual and also as an organization. And the key part is that you have to set your goals beyond the possible. If you just incrementally set your goals, you will never have an internal forcing function to abandon what made you successful up until now. You want to talk about fight or flight, take the way that your company has always been successful and then try and kill that to provoke what comes next. Google was great at this. I mean, how many times has Google tried to kill Gmail? Like 5 different times, and each time Gmail gets stronger.
They did kill Inbox though, and then I wasn't too happy with that, but that's another discussion.
we could have an entirely different hour about Google products that have been killed that crushed my soul.
But let's go back, because I mean, what you were talking about was the actual, I mean, the link between HR and corporate well-being with business. You know, how you can actually make people more performant. And you also were mentioning to focus on KPIs that are not incremental, but bigger and ambitious. Could you give an example of that? How can you put corporate well-being into KPIs that are very ambitious? What is there an example that comes to mind that makes it a little bit more, you know, comprehensible from my point of view?
Yeah. So I mean, I would, as a technical matter, I would say that I'm not sure KPIs are the right starting place for that, right? KPIs are, here's an initiative that we want to do, and you know, in Google speak, this is objectives and key results. So you have the objective, the thing you want to do. The key result is, how might an external person look at this and say, has this happened or not? I also think you need strategy and values at the top of that layer to provide guidance. So for instance, you know, being a senior leader is all about managing polarities. I mentioned before that a lot of times you have to make which decision is the least bad. Okay, when you're making those decisions, you know, and just in any sort of complexity, if you make a decision at large enough scale with a given amount of complexity, there's going to be at least 10 or 20% blowback. In other words, you make this decision to create this outcome, and then for a certain population, it's going to have the opposite effect.
True.
That's complexity. You have to be able to have you know, a way of dealing with that. So I think you need to have this layer of values of, okay, all things being equal, what do we prioritize? I mean, values can seem, you want to be careful. You want to avoid Enron values. Have you ever seen Enron's list of values? people in Europe probably know this, but Enron famous as a deceitful, nightmare of a company. But if you read their value statement, you're like, wow, these people really get it. These guys are woke. So I think instead of values, priorities are really important. And those priorities then help those OKRs, right? And so what I would do for my organization is we would have ambitious OKRs and then, objectives. And then one of the objectives would be, we want to do this while having good well-being. And therefore we would have a number of initiatives under there, knowing with eyes wide open that these are in tension, that these are in relationship with these other ones, right?
Sure,
and that's the whole management thing, is to take tough situations and polarities and balance them.
And it all builds back up to your values and the purpose of a company then, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I like to call it, priorities rather than values. And when I'm working with individual executives, I do a little bit of coaching, and there's inner priorities and outer priorities. Inner priorities are how you want to feel. Outer priorities are the stuff you want to do. And a lot of times, if you want to be very powerful, is to have a connection between your inner priorities and your outer priorities. They can't always be aligned, but if you're aware of what those alignments are, and then of course, I think the same thing is true between when a group of people articulate their shared values, and then how does that show up in the work that we're doing?
Yeah. When I come back to the values and the purpose of a company, and in general, the employees, they feel engaged and they feel also happy if they're part of a company with values that resemble their own. But if it's only focused on internally or focused on the company within, maybe it's limiting. How did you live, perhaps at Google, when the values also were transmitted to the outside world, to the actual clients, where you actually have those values and you want to live it, maybe from a corporate well-being or health point of view? How did Google do that? What did it change with the employees themselves when actually Google went out there to become more of a health company, let's say?
Yeah, so again, these are always intentions, right? If you read Google's 10 things we believe from the beginning, the first one was focus on the user and all else will follow, right? Yeah. So an extension of that is that if you burn yourself out focusing on the user and then you start making mistakes, well, you haven't actually fulfilled that goal, right? And so as usual, we normally don't figure that out until we bump into something, until we make some mistakes around this. So the whole dance of all of this is that you want to work really hard, but if you overextend that, then your performance begins to decrease. And so, the same things that are really good for team dynamics, right? Empathy, compassion, the ability to have conflict really, really well. Spoiler alert, these are things that are great for interacting with customers, right? So I do think that there's a similarity, particularly at the skill set. I think if a group of individuals are all relatively skilled at self-awareness, self-regulation, connection, and understanding, their ability to take care of customers is upgraded, their ability to work with each other is upgraded. But at the same time, I also don't want to discount that there is always a tension. Do you want to focus on short-term gains or long-term vision or performance? Sometimes circumstances don't allow us to have that luxury. And therefore, a bill is created that will need to be able to be paid later.
Yeah, sure. And of course, in my point of view, very often what I see then is that companies with all the knowledge that they have on their product and their services, sometimes it's their like perhaps obligation to take it outside also to their customers, even the things that they learned internally about how to manage teams or how to keep their own employees happy or even healthy. How can you actually put it out? I mean, there's a lot of inside information. I'm thinking about most particularly for example, pharmaceutical companies who are sitting on a pile of health and medical information. How can they make that more broader available, let's say, but also perhaps somebody who sells mattresses or shoes. There's a lot of health information or well-being information related in that product or known in that product. And it's not always shared with people. And I think if your value is in a certain way to help your customer or make your customer feel better, how can you actually put it out? There's always one of my challenges when I go to companies and work with them. And I think Google has done it quite somewhat.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, I think Google has done a really good job of that. So for instance, I'm on the board of the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. Google took its internally developed emotional intelligence leadership class and then spun it out and gave it to a nonprofit that was created that then takes that to other corporations, right? And now it's gone beyond corporations. You know, I'm sure you've heard of all the terrible mass shootings in the
Sure.
US and the crisis in Flint. Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute has actually asked to come in and help those communities in addition to the corporate. So there's that. And then something else I'd like to draw everybody's attention to. There's some well-being related material, but there's quite a bit of management philosophy and very practical things. It's called Rework. So there's actual case studies, pre-made tools for a lot of the stuff that I mentioned around OKRs and innovation. These tools are all there. So if you search for Google and then Rework, you'll see that those efforts are going. And it's interesting that you bring up pharmaceuticals because later today I have a meeting with a large Swiss pharmaceutical group that's a client of mine, and we're talking exactly about this sort of thing. And
I think we have the same client, but it's interesting what you mentioned. But I'll take, because I'm looking at the time right now. We have about 2 minutes, and I really saw one question coming in by Stef Verbraken, and I think it's really interesting. He mentions that there's a lot of engagement surveys that are sent out maybe at least once a year in almost every company, and I think there's two parts to this question. One is, how do you look at these kind of surveys? Because very often, in my experience, employees are a little bit resistant to them, and maybe they're not fully honest also when they complete them. And also, how about the actions that result from it? How often is actually these engagement surveys really used in actual strategies for their employees? What's your point of view on those?
So if they're not spurring specific action plans, I mean, if I know there's like this whole mental framework around engagement surveys, but if you just look at this as data gathering, if you collect data and then don't do anything with it, it's poisonous. It's better to not do them at all if that's the way you're doing them, because you're setting an expectation of, we care about these domains. At Google, there was a number of these. There was Google Geist, which is an annual 100% participation survey. And some of the things I mentioned were things that came out of Google Geist. I mean, one of the things that came out early was like, could you fire some people? Google managers were so good technically and so bad interpersonally that no one would ever fire a poor performer. So it was the actual employees who said, can we start doing some performance management? And then that led to the whole making sure that managers felt comfortable having unpleasant discussions and knew how to coach and mentor people out of those situations. There was a 10% wide Google pay hike at one point because people said that they were unhappy about their salaries. Diversity and inclusion arose as something that people really wanted to pay attention to. So I think you absolutely have to view it as actionable data. And at Google, executives' reviews were based in part on how well they did on executing against the Google. So there would be a big company meeting. They'd say, here's Google Geist. Here's the things that are awesome that we want to support doing continually. And then here's the things that are really deep concerned. And then different executives would come up and own the outcomes of that and then report on them 6 months later. Last
question, quick answer. How do you sell these surveys to the ones that are not really open or very eager to actually complete them? How do you position them in the company? What is the thing that you try to convince them about?
One is listen. You know, a real shadow of people who are interested in doing innovation and well-being work is we put ourselves here and our
Exactly.
client is here. We are the person who are wise and we have the information, and these people just don't get it. Can you imagine if your doctor treated, well, it's probably.
Your doctor does it that way, though.
I got a good doctor. He's a friend of mine now, but that is unhelpful. So therefore, the correct way to do is to become an anthropologist, to have a sense of intense curiosity about what is important to these people, what are the skills they have that can be leveraged, and then whatever is important to them. The nice thing is about these skills are so universal.
True.
Is to be able to apply that to them. And unfortunately now with COVID, pain is really useful. Would I have gotten into meditation if I wasn't so miserable when my dad was dying? Absolutely not. So there's an opportunity in difficulty. When we're fat, dumb, and happy, we don't want to change things up or put things at risk. So there's a real element to pain and discomfort. And when I say this, I don't want to minimize the suffering and the death and the economic hardship that people are going through. I wish that wasn't happening. And if it is, and it's happening at a societal level, this opens up doors to address these, as it's not nice to have. When I work with companies now, it's clear that in order to survive, they need to have a handle on resilience and innovation and managing complexity, and need very concrete things to do about it.
Thank you. So with that, I will hand back to France, who will be closing the session. Bill, thank you very much for your wise words. It was a very nice discussion. I hope we can do this again in the future, for sure.
Me too. It was a great pleasure.
France?
Yeah, indeed. Thanks a lot, Bill, and thanks, Christophe. And dear listeners, we're already wrapping up this 1 hour. For me, it was like in 1 minute flying over. But before we end, I would like to ask you 2 questions. On one hand, please answer the poll that will be launched right now. So normally you should see the poll. I'm not sure. Yes. So please give us some feedback so we can learn from it. And if you have any thing you would like to share, please give your feedback over programs@nexxworks.com via an email. We're very curious on that. And then secondly, we would like to ask you, if you enjoyed this session, then please invite some friends. So we can, of course, have them in the upcoming sessions, which is with Lavinia Ionita. She's a doctor and specialized in preventive healthcare. And she will talk about how you can mark stress and see stress and prevent stress as a company. So I'm very much looking forward to that session as well, moderated by Christophe. And then last but not least, we're there, of course, this week. So if you would like to hear an interesting podcast or read an interesting article, please use our blog or our Spotify account. So this summer will give you some inspiration as well. Thanks, Bill, again, for sharing these very interesting takeaways. Thanks, Christophe, for being with us and sharing your expertise and these questions with Bill as well. And then I hope to see you next week. All the participants also very much thanks. And then see you next week. Bye-bye.